The Supreme Court chamber wasn't built for showdowns, but today it felt like the prelude to one. It was supposed to be a procedural hearing, dry, dense, deeply formal. A joint congressional judicial committee was gathered to review the constitutional limits of federal oversight in state-level civil rights enforcement. But no one cared about the policy jargon. They came to see fireworks. Because seated at one end of the panel was Representative Jasmine Crockett, and at the other, Chief Justice John Roberts. From the moment she walked into the chamber, Jasmine felt the energy shift. She wasn't new to high-stakes hearings, but this one carried an air of calculation. The marble columns, the soft shuffle of staffers, the polished silence. It was all designed to remind people of where power lived, and she knew exactly what she was walking into. John Roberts sat composed, every movement deliberate. He was a man used to control. His reputation was immaculate, his voice calm, almost surgical, and behind the quiet gravitas there was always the subtext, that his interpretation of law was the final word. But today, Jasmine wasn't here to defer. She was here to question. She'd spent the last week buried in legal briefs, precedents, and obscure footnotes that had been cited once in 1973 and then buried again. She wasn't just showing up to make a statement, she was showing up to make history. When the chairwoman finally tapped her gavel and called the session into order, a dozen CSPAN cameras blinked to life. The room hushed. Jasmine straightened her spine. "As we begin," the chairwoman said, "we'll hear opening remarks from Representative Jasmine Crockett." Jasmine didn't clear her throat. She didn't shuffle her notes. She just began, clean, direct, and impossibly steady. "I want to thank this committee for the opportunity to speak today," she said. "But I need to be clear. We are not here just to discuss jurisdiction. We're here because too often, when marginalized communities are denied protection under the law, the response from those in power is, 'That's unfortunate, but it's not our job.' And I'm here to say, with all due respect, that isn't good enough." There were murmurs in the back. Roberts raised an eyebrow, barely, but she saw it. She continued, her tone still measured. "The Constitution is not a mirror. It does not reflect the priorities of whoever's reading it. It's a framework. And frameworks crack when they are selectively applied." The shift was subtle. Even some of the court clerks looked up. Jasmine turned slightly toward Roberts now, not in defiance, but in alignment, as if to say, "You're not my adversary. You're my audience." Roberts folded his hands. "Representative Crockett," he said in that dry, polished tone, "you speak of selective application of the law. Would you suggest the court has acted in bad faith?" The room stiffened. That was the trap. Imply the court was biased, and you lose your credibility. Avoid it, and you validate injustice. Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm suggesting that when the lived experience of people of color, of poor families, of disabled Americans, is treated as an anecdote rather than a data set, then the law is no longer blind. It's simply looking away." She let it hang in the air. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the moment before a verdict. Across the chamber, Roberts narrowed his eyes, not angrily, intellectually. He hadn't expected a soundbite. He'd just gotten a thesis, and Jasmine wasn't finished. Chief Justice John Roberts leaned slightly forward, his fingers interlaced as he studied Jasmine with the same precision he'd reserved for a complex amicus brief. "Representative Crockett," he said, "you argue that the law is looking away. Yet the court's role is not to remedy every societal grievance. It is to interpret the Constitution. It wasn't a dismissal, it was a scalpel, smooth, controlled, and sharpened by decades of judicial restraint." But Jasmine was ready. "I understand that, Mr. Chief Justice," she replied evenly. "But constitutional interpretation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by the questions you choose to ask, and the ones you decide to ignore." A few heads turned. One of the reporters raised their pen. That line, it meant something. "You claim judicial neutrality," she continued, "but neutrality in the face of inequality becomes complicity." Roberts offered a soft smile, almost too subtle to be caught on camera. You're suggesting this court acts out of intent? Jasmine didn't take the bait. She took a breath instead. I'm saying impact matters, she said. When you strike down federal protections on voting access under the pretense of states' rights, and those same states immediately enact barriers that disproportionately affect black and brown voters, that's not coincidence. That's consequence. And pretending otherwise isn't judicial modesty. It's institutional amnesia. A quiet gasp from the back row. Not theatrical. Just real. Roberts crossed one leg over the other. You're referencing Shelby County versus Holder, he said flatly. I am, Jasmine said, and I've read every word of that decision. You said the formula in the Voting Rights Act was outdated, that it punished states for past sins, but those same sins are resurfacing in the present, and now we have fewer tools to stop them. This time, Roberts didn't answer. Not right away. She leaned forward. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. This isn't a lecture, she said. It's a plea, from communities who've stood in the rain for 6 hours to vote, from neighborhoods where polling places vanish every cycle like clockwork, from people whose civil rights aren't theoretical, they're conditional. There it was, the heartbeat of the story. She wasn't reciting law, she was narrating impact. The Constitution wasn't abstract, it was a daily battlefield, and she knew the terrain better than anyone in that room. Roberts tapped his index finger once, reflexively, on the arm of his chair. That gesture alone revealed what his face never would. He was engaged. Your passion is noted, Representative, he said, but the rule of law cannot bend to sentiment. Jasmine held his gaze. I'm not asking it to bend, she replied. I'm asking it to reflect reality, because if the law can't see the people it governs, what's the point of calling it justice? Another beat of silence. The camera lights didn't blink, the room didn't breathe, and somewhere beyond the oak-paneled walls of the chamber, social media had already begun to burn with a single headline. Crockett just took the Constitution to church. The gavel hadn't moved, but the balance of the room had. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just answering questions, she was reframing them. And Roberts, for all his reputation, was beginning to recognize something rare. An opponent who didn't flinch and didn't overreach. She fought like a lawyer, but she spoke like someone who had lived the footnotes of every case citation. Roberts folded his hands again. Then perhaps you can clarify, Representative, he said. Would you advocate for a system where public opinion supersedes precedent? The question floated like fine smoke, measured, precise, and cloaked in reason, but Jasmine knew exactly what it was. A precedent trap. I don't think public opinion should drive the court, she said without hesitation. But neither should detachment. Precedent is not scripture. It's a reflection of the times it came from. And if we're applying 1970s frameworks to 2020s crises, we're not interpreting. We're insulating. A junior clerk near the back visibly froze mid-sentence on her notepad. Someone behind the cameras mouthed, "Did she just say that?" "Yes," Jasmine continued, flipping through a thin, tabbed binder. "Dred Scott was precedent. So was Plessy. So was Korematsu. You want to talk about precedent? Let's talk about how many times we've had to correct it." Now the atmosphere shifted entirely. Even Roberts blinked. He didn't interrupt. He pivoted. "But surely you agree the Constitution is a fixed document." Jasmine nodded slowly. "Yes, but the people interpreting it, they're not fixed. They bring their assumptions, their fears, their blind spots, which is why context matters, which is why who gets to decide matters." She paused, holding the moment like a weight she was willing to carry. "My point isn't to villainize the court," she added. "It's to remind everyone here that the law is only as just as the lens through which it's read. And when that lens is narrow, entire communities get left out of the frame." Someone on the Senate side whispered, "That's a soundbite." But Jasmine wasn't interested in sound bites. She leaned back and placed both hands on the table, calm, collected. "Justice isn't sterile," she said. It's not emotionless. It lives and breathes in public schools, in housing courts, in hospitals where people get denied care because of paperwork errors. If we refuse to acknowledge that the law has real-world fingerprints, then we're not defending justice. We're preserving distance. For the first time, John Roberts looked down at his notes, not to check anything, but because Jasmine's words had landed in a space he rarely had to defend, his silence. And on Twitter, the thread was already going viral. Jasmine Crockett just reminded the Chief Justice what justice is actually for. The conversation had shifted from courtroom theory to street-level truth, and Jasmine Crockett was leading it. What started as a formal exchange had become something more dangerous to those who relied on tradition as armor. She wasn't attacking the law. She was dragging it back to the people it was supposed to serve. John Roberts straightened in his chair, his voice tightening just slightly. Are you suggesting, then, that the doctrine of originalism is flawed? That we should abandon the framers' intent entirely? It was the classic defense. Invoke the Constitution's origin. Wrap yourself in parchment and principle. But Jasmine had heard that argument too many times to let it intimidate her. I'm saying originalism is selective, she answered. We can't pretend the framers wrote for all Americans when they actively excluded most of them. She leaned in slightly, steady as ever. They didn't envision women voting, or black people being free citizens, let alone legislators. So if we're interpreting their silence as sacred, we're preserving injustice, not principle. That line didn't just hit the room, it echoed. A law professor in the gallery shifted in his seat. A reporter mouthed, "Wow." Even the young court clerk froze, her pen hovering just above her notepad. Robert's brow furrowed, not in offense, but in calculation. Jasmine saw it. He was processing. Intent matters, she continued. But so does growth. The Constitution is a living document because the people it protects are living. And the moment we treat it like relic instead of a promise, we've already failed it. The room was now fully invested. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody looked away. Jasmine Crockett had seized the floor without ever raising her voice. This country was built on contradictions, she added. Freedom and slavery, liberty and silence. So the law has always been about wrestling those tensions into something more fair. That's not activism. That's the job. Roberts folded his hands tighter. That's a compelling argument, Representative. But there is still value in judicial restraint. Jasmine smiled, not mockingly, but like someone who had heard the word restraint used too often as an excuse. There's also value in judicial courage, she replied, especially when the cost of neutrality is another generation asking why justice feels so far away. That line stuck in the air like a suspended cord. It didn't resolve, and somewhere online the clip was already taking off. No sound effects, no background music, just the quiet power of a woman speaking legal truth with lived clarity. She didn't yell, she didn't flinch, she simply dismantled the bench with facts. By now, the hearing room didn't feel like a formality. It felt like a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett wasn't on a panel. She was on trial in the eyes of legacy. But what the panel didn't anticipate was that she'd come not as a defendant, but as a mirror. And mirrors make people uncomfortable. Roberts cleared his throat. So what would you propose, Congresswoman? A judiciary that bends to social tides? Where is the line between responsiveness and instability? He was giving her a way out, a chance to retreat into platitudes. She didn't take it. I'm not asking the courts to follow hashtags, she said plainly. I'm asking them to stop hiding behind neutrality while people's rights are eroded. A few heads turned. Jasmine hadn't raised her tone, but her clarity was louder than outrage. You want to talk about instability? She continued, flipping open her folder to a marked page. Let's talk about what happens when pregnant women are forced to cross state lines just to access health care. Let's talk about trans kids being legislated out of existence. Let's talk about the court saying, this is not our role, while real lives unravel. Now, the silence had changed. It wasn't awkward. It was electric. Law without empathy, she added, is just bureaucracy with a robe. A soft exhale escaped someone in the press row. Robert sat quietly. He didn't rebut. Not yet. And that's when Jasmine knew. The power wasn't in scoring points. It was in shifting the frame. "I'm not anti-court," she said. "I'm anti-apathy. There's a difference." A junior senator leaned in, almost involuntarily. On social media, the live feed was peaking, clips being clipped, texts flying. Jasmine pulled out a letter from her folder. It was handwritten, slightly wrinkled. "This is from a woman in Laredo. She lost custody of her child because her domestic violence claim was dismissed on procedural grounds, while the man who hurt her walked free. You want to tell her precedent matters more than protection?" She let the paper rest on the desk. This is what happens when interpretation becomes insulation, when we elevate doctrine over dignity. It wasn't a sound bite, it was a scar turned outward. Roberts finally responded, "I understand your passion, but laws must be built on something solid." "They should be," Jasmine said softly, "but they should also be human." And that's what made her different. She wasn't just quoting statutes, she was grounding them in sweat, in pain, in persistence, in people. By this point, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just answering questions, she was recentering the hearing around the people who never get invited into those rooms. She wasn't challenging authority for theatrics. She was doing what few dared to, force power to look down from its pedestal. Chief Justice Roberts, ever composed, adjusted his glasses. "You speak eloquently about lived experience, Representative, but isn't the law designed to rise above emotion? To offer a neutral, objective standard?" Jasmine gave a small, knowing smile. "If the law were truly neutral, Justice Roberts, explain to me why outcomes so often fall along lines of race, class, and zip code." That was not a rhetorical question. It was a blade, sharp, factual, and undeniable. "The idea of blind justice," she continued, "has become a myth we cling to when we don't want to face the biases embedded in our systems." Roberts paused, carefully parsing his reply. "Bias exists, yes, but the structure, our structure, is meant to protect against that." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Then the structure is failing." Now the room leaned in. "Let me ask you something, Justice," she said, voice calm but deliberate. "When was the last time someone you knew got evicted over a $300 missed utility payment, or was denied bail because they couldn't pay a fee less than what we spend on lunch?" Silence. Not out of offense, but reflection. "Because that's not abstract to me. That's Tuesday," she said. Then she told them about Marcus, a 19-year-old she'd represented as a public defender. Arrested for a broken taillight, held for 3 weeks because he couldn't post bond, lost his job, lost his apartment, all over a ticket. "You want to talk about the Constitution?" Jasmine said. "Let's talk about what happens when someone's rights exist on paper, but not in practice." Roberts tapped a finger lightly on his notes. Not a rebuttal, a reaction, one that said he knew she was right, even if he couldn't say it out loud. "This isn't about replacing the rule of law with feelings," Jasmine said. "It's about acknowledging that the law affects real people, and if we don't weigh that in our rulings, then we've prioritized order over justice." Outside the chamber, the video feed surged again. A new caption. "Jasmine Crockett isn't speaking to the court. She's speaking for the forgotten." By now, the hearing was no longer just a discussion about constitutional theory or judicial restraint. It had become a conversation about reality, raw, lived, and often ignored. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She had already raised the stakes. Justice Roberts folded his hands on the table and leaned slightly forward. "Representative Crockett, I'm not here to defend every outcome of our legal system, but reform requires caution. Overcorrection risks collapse." Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. "What you call caution, others experience as delay," she said. "And in that delay lives unravel." A beat. Then she continued. "There's a difference between preserving a system and preserving the people it was built to serve. One is static. The other demands motion. And right now, the system is sitting still while people drown. This wasn't theory anymore. This was survival. She reached into her folder and pulled out a folded eviction notice. "Meet Althea," she said, holding it up. Single mother, 2 kids, missed one payment because she had to choose between rent and insulin. This notice didn't care about the Constitution. It didn't wait for reform. The room was silent. Not because they were stunned, but because they couldn't look away. "I'm not asking this court to become a legislature," she added. "I'm asking it to stop being a shield for cruelty." Roberts's jaw shifted. Just a flicker. He wasn't angry. He was absorbing. "We talk about precedent like it's sacred," Jasmine said. "But precedent upheld segregation. Precedent denied women autonomy. Precedent told LGBTQ Americans they didn't deserve protection. So forgive me if I don't treat it like scripture." That hit harder than anything she'd said all day. One of the aides in the back audibly exhaled. Another wrote something quickly, almost instinctively. Jasmine wasn't stopping. "Every time you uphold a law without questioning its cost, you tell people like Althea that the system works, just not for them." She leaned forward, both palms on the table now. "I don't want activism from the bench. I want honesty. I want a legal system that stops pretending neutrality is the same as justice." For the first time, Roberts didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. The shift had already happened. The hearing was nearly over, but no one was packing up. No rustling papers, no closing binders. Just silence. A silence charged not with awkwardness, but with gravity. Chief Justice Roberts looked at Jasmine Crockett with a measured gaze. His hands were folded, but something in his posture had shifted. Less rigid, more aware. Jasmine glanced down once at her notes. Then she closed the folder and pushed it aside. "I brought data today," she said. "I brought case studies, constitutional analysis, even federal impact reports. But I also brought something you can't footnote: memory." And then she told them. Told them about being 14, watching her mother sign legal documents she didn't fully understand just to avoid eviction. Told them about her cousin who got pulled into the juvenile justice system over a school fight. Never even saw a lawyer until the day he pled guilty. Told them about the woman who came to her district office last year, shaking, holding a letter from a housing authority that gave her exactly 10 days to leave or be locked out. The woman couldn't read English. She thought it was a utility bill. "These aren't statistics," Jasmine said quietly. "They're people. And every ruling this court makes either gives them a fighting chance or it pushes them further out of sight." She paused. "And out of sight is where injustice thrives." That line didn't trend immediately. It wasn't flashy enough, but it was the line people remembered. Roberts didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He simply said, "Thank you, Representative Crockett." That was all. But outside those walls, it was enough. Because by the next morning, clips from the hearing had spread across every major platform. One journalist called it a masterclass in advocacy. A political blogger titled their piece, "She cross-examined the court without ever raising her voice." But Jasmine didn't care about the press. She cared about the letter she received from a law student in Jackson, Mississippi. The one that read, "I thought there was no place for people like me in law. Then I heard you." She cared about the voicemail from a retired judge in Colorado who said, "You reminded me why I put on the robe in the first place." She cared about the people who never had a mic, never got a platform, but who suddenly felt, if only for a moment, seen. Jasmine Crockett didn't rewrite the Constitution that day, but she redefined what it meant to defend it, not just in courts, but in living rooms, on bus stops, in classrooms, in shelters, in neighborhoods that laws often forget, and sometimes that's where the real verdict begins. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk in to impress, to perform, or to go viral. She walked in with a mission: to make the law see the people it too often forgets. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand applause. She told the truth, plain, personal, and powerful. And the power in that room, the black robes, the prestige, the centuries of precedent, had no choice but to listen. Because justice isn't just written in books, it's felt in eviction notices. It's heard in whispered prayers from mothers trying to keep the lights on. It lives in the spaces between laws, in the gray, the overlooked, the inconvenient. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend the Constitution. She reminded everyone that its promises are hollow if they're not upheld for the most vulnerable. So next time someone tells you the system is fair, ask them, fair for who? And if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unprotected by the very laws meant to serve you, know this: your story matters. Your voice matters. And people like Jasmine, they're fighting to make sure this country finally listens.